Elias Whitfield felt the autumn settling in his bones, a cold forecast of the winter that was coming for him and would not leave. From the deep leather chair on his porch, he watched the long, late-afternoon shadows stretch out from the cottonwoods and crawl across the valley floor. Ridgeback, Wyoming. It had been his whole world for 40 years, a canvas of sage and rock and hard-won pasture that he had painted his life upon. Now, the edges of that world were fraying, the colors fading with each shallow breath. The doctor had given him 6 months, a generous estimate, Elias thought, offered out of kindness rather than science. He figured he had until the first deep snows. He was not afraid of the dying. He was afraid of the leaving. Specifically, of leaving Clara. She came out onto the porch then, as if summoned by his worry. She carried a tray with 2 tin mugs of coffee, steam ghosting into the cooling air. At 20, she had her mother's grace but his own resilience, a combination that had produced a quiet strength that was the anchor of his final days. She moved with a purpose that was entirely her own. Her hands, though slender, were never idle. They could mend a fence line, soothe a fevered calf, or turn a tough cut of beef into a Sunday meal. She set the tray on the small table between them and took the chair beside his, her gaze following his out toward the distant, bruised purple of the mountains. "You're thinking too loud again, Papa," she said, her voice soft. He took the mug she offered, the warmth a welcome comfort against the chill that lived inside him now. Just watching the light change. It was not a lie. He was always watching. Watching the light, watching the land, and most of all, watching the men. They had been coming for months, ever since word had gotten out that Elias Whitfield was failing. They came on fine horses with polished saddles, their pockets heavy with ambition. Mr. Sterling, whose father owned the mercantile and half the land north of the creek, came with talk of combining properties, of dynasties. He spoke of Clara as if she were a prize plot of land, fertile and well situated. Mr. Prescott, whose family name carried weight back east, came with smooth words and softer hands, speaking of a life in Cheyenne, of society and comfort far from the dust of a working ranch. They were good men, by the world's measure. Solid, respectable obstacles to the future Elias envisioned. He watched them court his daughter. He watched them sit in his parlor, their boots self-consciously clean, their conversation circling endlessly around their own prospects. And he watched Clara listen, her face a mask of polite interest, her eyes revealing nothing. But the man Elias truly watched was the one who never came courting at all. Jesse Carr. He was out there now, in the near paddock, working with a young colt that had a mean streak. Jesse did not fight the horse. He moved with it, a slow, patient dance of advance and retreat, his voice a low murmur Elias could not hear but could feel in the calm that was slowly settling over the animal. Jesse was 27, with no property to his name and no inheritance to look forward to. He had his monthly wage, a good saddle he'd made himself, and a reputation for being the last man to quit a job and the first to return something that was not his. He was quiet, solid, and as steady as the northern star, and he kept a respectful, almost painful distance from Clara. That distance, Elias knew, was the most honest declaration a man like Jesse could make. It was a confession of his own perceived inadequacy, and in that, a profound gesture of respect for her and for the man who owned the ground he walked on. Clara watched him too. Elias saw it in the way her mending would pause in her lap when Jesse crossed the yard, the way her eyes would find him at the far end of a branding fire. She saw what he saw. Competence. Honor. A quiet that was not empty, but full. Elias had decided months ago that watching was not enough. A man's character was not found in parlor conversation. It was revealed under pressure, in moments of solitude when he believed no one was looking. So Elias had begun his tests, a series of quiet examinations recorded in a small leather-bound notebook he kept in his desk drawer. The first test had been simple. He'd taken a canvas pouch containing $60, a full month's wage for a top hand, and left it on a workbench in the tack room, half hidden under a piece of harness leather. He had made sure Jesse was the only one scheduled to be working there that afternoon. Elias had watched from the hayloft, his heart a tight knot in his chest. He saw Jesse find the pouch. He saw him open it, see the contents, and then close it again. Jesse looked around the empty barn, his brow furrowed, not with temptation, but with concern. He tucked the pouch inside his shirt and went back to his work. An hour later, when Elias was back in his study, Jesse knocked quietly on the door. He did not say a word, just placed the pouch squarely in the middle of the desk and left. He had not sought praise or reward. He had simply returned what was not his. Elias had opened his notebook and made an entry. June 10th. The money returned. Not a word spoken. He assumed it was mine and that I had been careless. He protected my property and my dignity. The second test had involved Shadow, his own personal mount, a black stallion with a spirit as wild as the country he was bred in. The horse trusted Elias and few others. A trip to Ridgeback for urgent supplies was needed, a hard 30-mile ride. Elias could have sent any of the other hands on a lesser horse. Instead, he sought out Jesse. "I need you to take Shadow into town. There's a list at the mercantile. Don't spare him, but don't break him." It was a contradiction, a test of judgment. A man who lusted for power would ride the horse hard to prove his dominance. A fool would ride him too slow and miss the urgency. Jesse had simply nodded. He'd spent a full 10 minutes with the horse in the corral, not saddling him, just talking to him, letting the animal catch his scent and feel the calm in his hands. He rode out at a steady, ground-eating pace. He returned before nightfall, the supplies secure, the horse tired but not lathered, cooled down properly before being stalled. Jesse had understood the balance. He had respected the animal and the task. Elias wrote in his journal, July 2nd, "He understands that control is not about force. It is about respect. He showed the horse the same courtesy he shows the men." Clara had her own ledger, one kept not in a book but in her heart. She noted the day the latch on the smokehouse door broke. She'd mentioned it in passing at breakfast. By lunchtime, Jesse had repaired it, the ironwork stronger than the original. He never mentioned it. She saw him one afternoon with a new filly that had thrown two other, more experienced men. The men were for breaking the horse's spirit. Jesse had waved them off. He'd spent the rest of the day in the round pen, not riding, just standing, letting the filly grow accustomed to his presence. He left a bucket of water and walked away. The next day, he did the same. And the day after. On the fourth day, she watched from her bedroom window as he walked up to the filly and gently placed a hand on her neck. The horse did not flinch. It was the patience of the man, the deep, abiding patience, that caught in her throat. The suitors in the parlor spoke of conquering the world. Jesse Carr was content to earn the trust of one small part of it. The final test had been the biggest. A cattle drive to the railhead at Cheyenne. A deal for 300 head was pending, but the buyer was a known shark. Elias was too weak to make the trip. He gathered his senior hands. In front of them all, he looked at Jesse. "You'll lead the drive. You have full authority to negotiate the price. Your word will be my word." The other men shifted, their surprise and envy a palpable thing in the dusty air of the barn. It was a responsibility far above Jesse's station. It was a declaration of trust that was almost reckless. For 3 days, the ranch was quiet. Clara felt the tension in her father's silence. He sat on the porch, his gaze fixed on the southern road. He was not just waiting on the fate of his cattle, he was waiting on the confirmation of a man's soul. On the evening of the third day, Jesse and the men returned. He was bone-weary and trail-dusted, but he walked straight to the main house. He handed Elias a bank draft. The number written on it was a full $1 ahead more than Elias had dared to hope for. "He tried to lowball us," Jesse said, his voice raspy from dust. "Said the market was turning. I told him we'd just drive them back home then. We could wait." "That was a bluff," Elias said, looking at him over the paper. "Yes, sir," Jesse said, "but he didn't know that." He then produced a small, worn ledger, an accounting of the expenses, every cent. Elias did not even look at it. He looked at the man standing before him, a man who had been given power and had used it wisely, a man who had been given authority and had returned it, along with a profit and a full accounting. He was a steward, not a conqueror. Elias had leaned back, a sense of profound peace settling over him. He had his answer. That night, his entry in the notebook was brief. August 29th. He brought them home. All of them. He is the man. The catalyst came on a Tuesday in late September. It arrived in the form of Mr. Sterling, dressed in his Sunday best, his face scrubbed and earnest. He found Elias on the porch, and, after a long, awkward preamble about the weather and the health of the herd, he formally asked for permission to court Clara with the intention of marriage. He laid out his prospects, the deeds to his land, the inheritance that awaited him. He was respectful, honorable, and offered everything a father was supposed to want for his daughter. Elias listened patiently. He thanked Mr. Sterling for his honesty and his high regard for his daughter. He told him he would give him an answer in due time. When the man was gone, a cloud of expensive cologne lingering in his wake, Elias felt the cold in his bones sharpen. Due time was a luxury he no longer possessed. Jesse would never make such a formal request. He would never presume. His honor was the very thing that kept him from acting. Elias knew then that he would have to break the rules. He would have to be the one to bridge the distance Jesse so carefully maintained. He sent one of the kitchen staff to fetch him. "Tell Mr. Carr I wish to see him in my study after supper." The study, not the porch for a casual chat, not the barn for ranch business. The study was for contracts and wills and final things. The message was clear. This was important. Clara heard the summons and her heart stilled. She watched from the kitchen window as Jesse received the message. She saw the confusion on his face, followed by a quiet apprehension. He looked toward the main house, his expression unreadable, and then nodded. All through supper, a silence hung over the table. Clara and her father ate, the clink of silverware on pottery the only sound. His eyes met hers once, and in them she saw a resolve that was both fierce and sorrowful. She knew. Jesse washed his face and hands at the pump, the cold water a shock that did little to clear the unease in his mind. A summons to the study could only mean one of two things. He was being promoted to foreman, or he was being fired. Given his station, the latter seemed far more likely. Had he done something wrong? Had the bluff with the cattle buyer been discovered and deemed an act of insubordination? He put on a clean shirt, the one he saved for trips to town. He ran a hand through his damp hair and made his way to the house, his boots heavy on the packed earth. The door to the study was ajar. He knocked softly. "Come in, Jesse." Elias Whitfield was behind his large oak desk. The room smelled of old leather, pipe tobacco, and the faint, medicinal scent of the liniment he used for the ache in his joints. A single oil lamp cast a pool of warm light on the desk, leaving the corners of the room in deep shadow. It felt like a stage. Elias looked smaller behind the desk, his illness having whittled away at his formidable frame, but his eyes were as sharp as ever. They missed nothing. "Close the door," Elias said. Jesse did as he was told, the click of the latch sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet room. He stood before the desk, his hat in his hands, waiting. Elias gestured to the chair opposite him. "Sit." Jesse sat. The chair was leather, more comfortable than anything he was used to. He felt out of place. For a long moment, Elias said nothing. He simply studied Jesse, his gaze so intense it felt like a physical weight. "You've been with me for 5 years, Jesse," he began, his voice a low rasp. "Yes, sir. 5 years this spring. You're a good hand. The best I've ever had. I just do the work, Mr. Whitfield." "Yes, you do," Elias said. He leaned forward slightly, the lamplight carving deep lines into his face. "Mr. Sterling paid me a visit this afternoon. A fine young man. He has a great deal of land, a thriving business, a good name. He asked for my permission to court Clara." Jesse felt the words like a physical blow. A cold, heavy feeling settled in his stomach. He had known this was inevitable. Clara was beautiful and capable, and the heir to all of this. Of course, men like Sterling would come for her. It was the way of the world. He kept his face impassive, his eyes on the inkwell on the desk. He said nothing. It was not his place. "He believes he can offer her a good life," Elias continued, his eyes never leaving Jesse's face. "Security. A future. I have to think about what's best for her. This ranch is a hard life for a woman alone." Jesse forced himself to nod. The words were stones in his throat. Of course. It was a father's duty. He had to protect her. And a man like him, with nothing but the sweat of his brow to offer, was not protection. He was a risk. Elias leaned back, his voice becoming softer, almost conversational. "Another man could offer her more, Jesse. More than you. Land. A name. Security. He could give her a life without calluses on her hands." The silence stretched. Elias was waiting. This was not an idle observation. It was a question. It was a challenge. Everything in Jesse screamed at him to stay silent, to nod and agree and walk out of this room and out of her life. It was the honorable thing to do. But as he sat there, the image of Clara's face rose in his mind, the way she smiled when she thought no one was looking, the intelligence in her eyes, the quiet strength that ran deeper than any man's fortune. He thought of a life for her with Sterling, a life of polite society and empty courtesies. A safe life. A smaller life. He lifted his head and met the old man's gaze. His voice, when it came, was low and steady, stripped of all artifice. It was the truest thing he had ever said. Not more of what counts. He had not argued about the land or the money. He had conceded those points without a fight, but he had drawn a line at the boundary of the human heart. There, in that territory, he would not yield. Elias Whitfield held his gaze for a long, breathless moment. He had been testing this man for months, testing his honesty, his judgment, his patience, his integrity. But this was the final test, the one that could not be staged with a money pouch or a prized horse. He had tested his spirit, and the answer had come back, clear and true. A slow, faint smile touched Elias's lips. It was a smile of profound relief, of a long and difficult task finally completed. He had found his man. "No," Elias said softly, "not more of what counts." He reached for a small bell on his desk and rang it. A moment later, the door opened and Clara stepped inside. She had been waiting in the hall. Her eyes went from her father to Jesse and back again. She saw the tension had broken, replaced by a quiet understanding that filled the room. "Clara, my dear," Elias said, his voice regaining some of its old strength. "Jesse and I were just discussing your future." He looked at Jesse. "Tell her what you told me." Jesse stood, turning to face her. His heart was hammering against his ribs, but his gaze was direct. He felt he was standing on the edge of a cliff, the whole world falling away behind him. "Your father," he began, his voice a little hoarse, "your father said another man could offer you more." And I said not more of what counts. Clara's eyes, searched his. She saw no pride in them, only a vulnerable bedrock honesty. This was the truth she had been seeing in him all along, in every quiet gesture, in every respectful silence. He was not asking. He was not demanding. He was simply stating his own worth, a worth not measured in acres or dollars. She took a step forward. "He's right, Papa," she said, her voice clear and certain. "He is right." Elias nodded, a deep and final satisfaction settling upon him. He pushed himself up from his chair, leaning heavily on the desk. He took his daughter's hand, her skin warm and vital against his own, which felt thin as paper. He walked the few steps to where Jesse stood, rooted to the spot. Elias looked at Jesse, at the man who had earned his trust not with words but with deeds. "The ranch will be yours to run," Elias said, his voice formal like a vow. "Hers to own. You will be partners in all things. You will protect her. And you," he said, looking at Clara, "will look after him. He's a good man, but a slow one. He needs a patient heart to guide him." He then placed Clara's hand firmly in Jesse's. His hand was rough and calloused. Hers was smooth and strong. The connection was immediate, solid, and real. It felt like coming home. "I've been watching you, Jesse," Elias said, his eyes locking with his. "More than you know." He turned his gaze to Clara, a lifetime of love contained within it. "I've been watching for you, girl. For months. I wrote it all down." He gestured toward the desk drawer. "There's a notebook in there. Every test, every observation. It's for you. After I'm gone, if you ever have a moment of doubt, you read it. So you'll always know. So you'll always know I didn't leave you to chance. I left you to the best man I could find." The courtship was a simple, quiet affair. It was not a discovery of one another, but a confirmation. It was in shared meals at the big dining table, the silence comfortable and full. It was in long walks on Sunday afternoons, their hands clasped, their conversation not about the future, but about the present, the needs of the ranch, the mending of a fence, the coming winter. The town of Ridgeback watched, and the speculation that had buzzed in the mercantile and the saloon settled into a quiet, collective nod of approval. This made sense. This was right. The wedding was held 2 months later, in the front parlor, as the first snows began to dust the high peaks. Clara wore a simple cream-colored dress she had made herself. Jesse wore a new suit that felt stiff and foreign. The circuit preacher said the words, but the real vows had been made long before, in unspoken moments of trust and observation. It was a promise not of passion, but of permanence, of steadfastness. A union not of 2 fortunes, but of 2 characters. 5 years later, the evening light was the color of warm honey, bathing the valley in a gentle, forgiving glow. Jesse Carr sat on the porch of the main house, in the same deep leather chair where Elias Whitfield had spent his final months. The ranch was thriving. He had expanded the herd, improved the bloodlines, and earned the respect of the men who worked for him, not because he was the boss, but because he was the first to rise and the last to bed down. He was a good steward. The screen door creaked open and Clara came out, carrying a sleeping child in her arms. He was 4 years old, a sturdy boy with his father's dark hair and his mother's watchful, intelligent eyes. His name was Elias. She sat in the chair beside Jesse, settling the boy in her lap. For a long while, they just sat in the companionable silence that was the bedrock of their marriage, watching the light change. In her free hand, Clara held a small, leather-bound notebook. Its pages were worn, the corners softened from years of being read and reread. She opened it to a page near the beginning. The ink faded, but the script still strong and clear. "I read this one today," she said softly. Her finger traced the words. June 10th. The money returned. Not a word spoken. He assumed it was mine and that I had been careless. He protected my property and my dignity. Jesse looked at the book, then at his wife. He had never read it. It was hers. A final gift from her father. But he knew its contents through her, through the way she would sometimes look at him, a deep and abiding certainty in her eyes that was his greatest strength. "He never told me about that," Jesse said, his voice quiet. "He didn't have to," Clara replied. "He just watched. He saw all of it." She closed the book, holding it to her chest. "He saw you." Jesse reached out and took her hand, his thumb stroking the back of it. The hand that held the book, that held their sleeping son, that had held his heart for all these years. He looked out at the land, his land, their land, and at the mountains that stood guard over it all. Everything he had ever wanted was right here, on this porch. He hadn't had the words to ask for it, or the right, but a wise old man had seen it anyway. Clara leaned her head against his shoulder. "You're still a slow man, Jesse Carr," she murmured, a smile in her voice. He felt the warmth of her, the solid, grounding presence of his family. He smiled, a slow, easy smile that reached his eyes. "Got here, didn't I?" he said. And he had. He was home,